The frost came early to Pine Ridge in 1981, settling over the cornfields like a shroud the morning Sarah Mitchell vanished. She was 17 years old, a senior at Meadow County High, last seen walking home on October 9th with her backpack and a library book about constellations. For 43 years, her disappearance remained the town's darkest mystery. Nobody suspected that the answer had been living among them all along, wearing a face they trusted. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell had the kind of smile that made people feel like they mattered. Teachers at Meadow County High School said she listened when others talked, remembered birthdays, left encouraging notes in lockers when she knew someone was struggling. She was 17 in the fall of 1981, a straight-A student who worked weekends at her father's hardware store on Main Street and volunteered Tuesday evenings at the Pine Ridge Public Library, shelving books and helping elderly patrons find large print mysteries. She had dark brown hair that fell past her shoulders, freckles across her nose that deepened in summer, and a habit of tucking her hair behind her right ear when she was concentrating. Her mother, Carol, would later tell investigators that Sarah had been planning to study astronomy at the University of Wisconsin, that she'd spent hours lying in the backyard with a telescope her grandfather had given her for her 16th birthday, mapping stars and planets in a worn notebook with a blue cover. October 9th, 1981 was a Friday. Sarah wore her favorite denim jacket over a yellow sweater, jeans with a small tear at the left knee, and white canvas sneakers with green laces. She attended all 6 of her classes that day, ate lunch in the cafeteria with her best friend Amy Carlson and 2 other girls from the volleyball team, stayed after school for 45 minutes to work on a chemistry project in the lab with her lab partner Marcus Green. The last person to see her at school was her English teacher, Mrs. Helen Dorset, who waved goodbye to Sarah in the parking lot at 3:57 in the afternoon. Sarah had been carrying her brown backpack, the one with patches sewn onto it from national parks she'd visited with her family, and a hardcover library book titled The Cosmos by Carl Sagan that she'd checked out 3 days earlier. The walk from Meadow County High School to the Mitchell family home on Birch Lane was 2.3 miles, a route Sarah had traveled hundreds of times since starting high school. She usually cut through the town square, past the hardware store where her father Robert worked, sometimes stopping in to say hello if she saw his truck parked outside. On that particular Friday, Robert Mitchell was at a supplier meeting in Madison and wouldn't return until evening. Sarah's mother was at home preparing dinner, expecting her daughter by 4:30 at the latest. The sky that afternoon was gray and heavy with the threat of rain, the temperature dropping into the low 40s. Leaves littered the sidewalks in shades of rust and gold, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from chimneys across town. At 4:15, Gerald Thompson, who owned Thompson's Pharmacy on Main Street, saw Sarah walking past his storefront. He remembered because she waved at him through the window where he was arranging Halloween decorations, orange and black streamers he'd been meaning to put up for a week. At 4:22, Donna Pierce, a crossing guard who worked the intersection near the elementary school, watched Sarah turn left onto Maple Avenue, heading toward the residential neighborhoods on the east side of town. Donna would later tell police that Sarah seemed perfectly normal, not hurried or distressed, just a teenager walking home on a Friday afternoon. At 4:28, Martin Kowalski, who was raking leaves in his front yard on Maple Avenue, nodded hello to Sarah as she passed. He remembered her smiling back, adjusting the straps on her backpack. That was the last confirmed sighting. Sarah never made it home. When 4:30 came and went without her arrival, Carol Mitchell wasn't immediately concerned. Sometimes Sarah stopped at Amy's house, or took a longer route through the park if the weather was nice. But by 5 o'clock, as darkness began settling over Pine Ridge and the temperature continued dropping, Carol's unease grew into something sharper. She called Amy's house first. Amy's mother said the girls hadn't made plans, that Amy had come straight home after school. Carol called 2 other friends, then the library, then the hardware store, to see if Sarah had gone there to wait for her father. Nobody had seen her. By 5:30, with Robert still an hour away from home, Carol Mitchell called the Pine Ridge Police Department and reported her daughter missing. Sheriff Thomas Wade arrived at the Mitchell home at 5:47. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with silver hair and a deep voice, someone who'd served as sheriff for nearly 20 years and knew every family in Meadow County. He took Carol's statement calmly, writing details in a small spiral notebook, asking about Sarah's friends, her habits, whether she'd been upset about anything recently. Carol said no. Sarah had seemed happy, excited about an upcoming volleyball tournament, looking forward to Halloween. Wade called in his 2 deputies, Frank Morrison and young David Chen, who'd only been with the department for 8 months. They began driving Sarah's usual route from school to home, shining flashlights into yards and alleys, stopping anyone they saw on the streets to ask if they'd noticed a teenage girl in a yellow sweater and denim jacket. When Robert Mitchell arrived home at 6:35 and learned his daughter was missing, he immediately organized neighbors into search parties. Within an hour, more than 30 people were walking through Pine Ridge with flashlights and calling Sarah's name. They checked the park, the woods behind the school, the walking trails along Pine Creek that wound through the eastern edge of town. They knocked on doors, woke sleeping dogs, searched sheds and garages, and anywhere a person might have taken shelter or been hidden. The temperature dropped to 37 degrees. A light rain began falling just after 8 o'clock, cold and steady, soaking through jackets and turning the ground muddy. Sheriff Wade established a command post at the police station, a small brick building on 2nd Street with 3 holding cells and an office that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. He called the Wisconsin State Police and requested additional resources, search dogs, extra personnel. By 9 o'clock, the story had reached the local news stations in Madison. By 10 o'clock, Sarah Mitchell's school photo was being broadcast across southern Wisconsin, a smiling girl with dark hair and braces, the picture taken just 6 weeks earlier for the yearbook. The Mitchells' phone began ringing constantly, friends and relatives calling to ask what they could do, reporters asking for statements, strangers claiming they'd seen something suspicious. The official search began at first light on Saturday, October 10th. More than 200 volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot as dawn broke cold and gray over Meadow County. Sheriff Wade divided them into teams, assigned grid patterns, distributed maps showing which areas to cover. State police brought tracking dogs that picked up Sarah's scent along Maple Avenue, following it for 3 blocks before losing the trail near the corner of Maple and 6th Street. A quiet intersection surrounded by old houses with wide porches and oak trees that had stood for a century. The dogs circled and whined, but couldn't reacquire the scent. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished at that spot, lifted out of the world without a trace. Investigators found Sarah's backpack at 11:30 that morning. It was lying in a ditch beside County Road 14, approximately 4 miles south of where she was last seen, partially hidden beneath a pile of wet leaves. The backpack was muddy but intact, its contents undisturbed. Inside were her school notebooks, 3 textbooks, a pencil case, a pack of chewing gum, and a wallet containing her school ID, $7 in cash, and a photo of her family taken at the Wisconsin Dells the previous summer. The library book was also inside, its due date stamped for October 20th. What wasn't there was any sign of Sarah herself. No blood, no torn fabric, no indication of violence. The backpack's location made no sense. County Road 14 was a rural route that connected Pine Ridge to the neighboring town of Clarksville, not somewhere a person would walk by choice, especially not after dark. There were no houses nearby, just farmland and dense stretches of woods. The discovery shifted the investigation's focus. This was no longer a case of a teenager who'd gotten lost or run away. Someone had taken Sarah Mitchell, had driven her somewhere along that county road, and for reasons unknown had discarded her backpack while keeping her. Sheriff Wade held a press conference that evening, his face grim as he stood before cameras and reporters, and announced that Sarah's disappearance was being investigated as a suspected abduction. He asked anyone who'd driven County Road 14 between 4:30 and 6 o'clock the previous evening to contact the police immediately. He asked if anyone had seen unfamiliar vehicles, anything suspicious, any detail, no matter how small. The calls came in by the dozens. People reported seeing cars and trucks they didn't recognize, strangers asking for directions, vehicles parked in unusual places. Every lead was investigated, every vehicle tracked down, and its driver questioned. A man from Clarksville who'd been driving County Road 14 around 5 o'clock said he'd seen a dark sedan pulled off on the shoulder near where the backpack was found, but he hadn't stopped. Hadn't seen anyone near the vehicle, couldn't describe it beyond dark-colored and possibly a Chevrolet or Ford. Another witness reported seeing a blue pickup truck speeding through Pine Ridge around 4:45, driving erratically, but couldn't provide a license plate number. Investigators spent days chasing these fragments of information, but none led anywhere conclusive. Sheriff Wade assembled a list of suspects, starting with the most obvious categories. Sex offenders within a 50-mile radius were questioned, and their whereabouts on October 9th verified. Former students who'd been expelled or had conflicts with the school were interviewed. Drifters and transients known to pass through Meadow County were tracked down. Marcus Green, Sarah's lab partner, and the last person confirmed to have been alone with her at school, was questioned extensively, but his alibi was solid. He'd gone straight home after Sarah left, had dinner with his family, spent the evening watching television with his parents and younger brother. Amy Carlson and Sarah's other friends were interviewed, their relationships examined, but nothing suggested conflict or motive. Teachers, coaches, librarians, anyone who'd had regular contact with Sarah was scrutinized. Every lead pointed nowhere. Robert and Carol Mitchell appeared on television multiple times over the following weeks, pleading for information, begging whoever had taken their daughter to let her come home. Carol's face became a fixture on the evening news, her eyes red from crying, her voice breaking as she described Sarah's kindness, her dreams of studying the stars, the hole her absence had torn through their family. Robert stood beside his wife, his jaw clenched tight, his hands trembling when he spoke. They offered a reward, $5,000 for information leading to Sarah's safe return, money they'd borrowed against their house. The community rallied around them, organizing fundraisers and prayer vigils, covering the town in missing person flyers with Sarah's face printed above a phone number to call. But as October turned to November, and November faded into December, the leads dried up and the searches yielded nothing. The woods and fields around Pine Ridge were combed repeatedly. Abandoned buildings were checked and rechecked. Every body of water in the county was dragged. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields after the harvest, looking for any sign of Sarah's yellow sweater or her white sneakers or the denim jacket she'd been wearing. Nothing was found. It was as if she'd been erased from existence at 4:28 on that Friday afternoon, the moment after Martin Kowalski watched her walk past his house on Maple Avenue. The case consumed Sheriff Wade through the winter of 1981 and into the spring of 1982. He worked 16-hour days, reviewed every statement, followed every possible angle. He brought in FBI profilers who suggested Sarah had likely been taken by someone she knew or recognized, someone who'd made her feel safe enough to get into a vehicle. The profile described a white male between 25 and 45 years old, possibly someone with local connections, someone who'd been planning this crime or had acted on impulse when opportunity presented itself. But profiles without evidence were just theories, and theories didn't bring Sarah Mitchell home or give her family answers. By the time Sarah's 18th birthday arrived in March of 1982, the investigation had effectively stalled. Sheriff Wade kept the case open, continued following up on occasional tips, but new leads had stopped coming in. The reward money went unclaimed. The flyers on telephone poles faded and tore in the wind. Pine Ridge tried to move forward, but the shadow of October 9th hung over the town like a permanent fog. Parents became more protective of their children. People locked doors that had never been locked before. Strangers were met with suspicion. The Mitchell family home on Birch Lane became a shrine of waiting, Carol maintaining Sarah's bedroom exactly as it had been, Robert spending evenings staring at maps and case files, refusing to accept that his daughter was gone. The case changed Pine Ridge in ways both visible and invisible. It destroyed the town's innocence, that small town certainty that terrible things happened elsewhere to other people. It taught everyone that safety was an illusion, that evil could reach into the most ordinary afternoon and steal away someone you loved. And perhaps most cruelly, it taught them that some questions might never be answered, that some doors once opened could never be closed. Sarah Mitchell became a ghost that haunted Meadow County, a name spoken in hushed tones, a warning to children about stranger danger, a story that older residents told younger ones about the way things used to be before October 9th, 1981, when a girl with freckles and dreams of studying stars walked home from school and vanished into silence. Carol Mitchell marked every October 9th for 43 years. She would wake before dawn on those mornings and drive to the small cemetery on the north edge of Pine Ridge, where a memorial stone stood beneath a maple tree, even though there was no body buried beneath it. The stone was simple gray granite engraved with Sarah's name, her birth date, and the day she disappeared, followed by words Carol had chosen herself. Forever in our hearts, forever 17. She would sit on the ground beside the marker regardless of weather, sometimes for hours, talking to her daughter about the years that had passed, about the life Sarah should have lived, about grandchildren she would never meet. Robert had joined her every year until 2003, when a heart attack took him at 68 years old. The doctor said it was coronary disease, but Carol knew it was grief that had killed him, the slow erosion of hope wearing away at his heart until it simply stopped. The case was officially reopened 3 times over the decades. The first was in 1994, 13 years after Sarah's disappearance, when Sheriff Thomas Wade retired and his replacement, a younger man named Richard Porter from Milwaukee, decided to review all cold cases with fresh eyes. Porter spent 6 months going through the original files, re-interviewing witnesses whose memories had faded and changed with time, sending evidence to new forensic labs that promised advances in testing. He focused particularly on the backpack, hoping that DNA technology might reveal something investigators in 1981 had missed, but the results came back inconclusive. Too many people had handled the backpack during the original investigation before anyone understood the importance of preserving DNA evidence. The traces that existed were degraded and useless, contaminated by well-meaning volunteers who'd touched the fabric without gloves, by deputies who'd carried it back to the station, by the Mitchells themselves who'd held it and wept over it when it was returned to them. Porter also pursued a theory that Sarah might have been a victim of a serial offender operating in Wisconsin during the early 1980s. There had been 3 other disappearances of teenage girls within a 200-mile radius between 1979 and 1983, cases that shared certain similarities. Young women vanishing during daylight hours, minimal evidence left behind, bodies never recovered. Porter contacted investigators in those jurisdictions, compared case files, looked for patterns in the geography and timing. He even arranged for a FBI behavioral analysis unit to review all 4 cases together. But the connections were too thin, the differences too significant. The other victims had disappeared from cities, not small towns. 2 had been last seen at shopping malls, not walking home from school. The theory dissolved under scrutiny, and by late 1995, Porter had exhausted his leads. The case went cold again, returned to its file cabinet in the basement of the police station, where it gathered dust alongside decades of other unsolved crimes. Pine Ridge changed dramatically in the years following Sarah's disappearance. The hardware store, where Robert Mitchell had worked, closed in 1997, unable to compete with a Home Depot that opened in Clarksville. Main Street gradually emptied of locally owned businesses, replaced by chain restaurants and dollar stores that came and went with economic cycles. The high school was renovated in 2001, its old brick facade covered with modern siding, new wings added to accommodate a growing population of families moving out from Madison, seeking cheaper housing and quieter lives. Many of these new residents knew nothing about Sarah Mitchell, had never heard the story that older residents carried like a scar. To them, Pine Ridge was just another small Wisconsin town with good schools and affordable homes, not a place haunted by an unsolved disappearance from before they were born. But those who had lived in Pine Ridge in 1981 never forgot. They carried the memory in different ways. Some, like Martin Kowalski, who'd been the last person to see Sarah walking past his house, were consumed by guilt over details they might have noticed and didn't. Conversations they might have had that could have changed everything. Kowalski moved away from Pine Ridge in 1989, unable to rake leaves each October without remembering that Friday afternoon, the girl with the backpack who'd smiled and waved before vanishing into the twilight. Others, like Amy Carlson, Sarah's best friend, built their adult lives around the absence. Amy became a social worker specializing in missing persons cases, dedicating her career to helping other families navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of having a loved one disappear. She married late, had no children, said she couldn't bear the thought of bringing life into a world where people could simply vanish without explanation. The second official reopening came in 2009, 28 years after the disappearance. A new sheriff, Margaret Hayes, had been elected on a platform that included addressing cold cases with modern technology. Hayes was the first female sheriff in Meadow County history, a former Milwaukee detective with a reputation for thoroughness and a personal investment in justice for victims everyone else had forgotten. She assigned Detective Luis Fernandez, her most experienced investigator, to review the Mitchell case, with particular attention to advances in forensic science that hadn't existed in the 1980s. Fernandez was meticulous, a man in his 40s who'd grown up in Chicago and brought big-city investigative techniques to rural Wisconsin. He'd heard about the Sarah Mitchell case when he first joined the Meadow County Sheriff's Department, had been struck by how the older deputies spoke about it in hushed tones, as if invoking a curse. Fernandez spent the better part of a year rebuilding the case from scratch. He digitized every document, every photograph, every witness statement from 1981, creating a searchable database that allowed him to cross-reference details that earlier investigators had to track manually. He located and re-interviewed every surviving witness, including Gerald Thompson from the pharmacy, who was now in his 70s and struggling with memory problems, Donna Pierce, the crossing guard, who'd moved to Arizona but still remembered Sarah's yellow sweater, and dozens of others whose recollections had been altered by time and the stories they'd told themselves over decades. He examined the original evidence with new forensic tools, sent fibers from Sarah's backpack to labs that could analyze microscopic details invisible to 1980s technology, commissioned ground-penetrating radar surveys of areas near County Road 14 where the backpack had been found. The radar surveys revealed nothing. The fiber analysis showed traces of soil and plant material consistent with the Pine Ridge area, but nothing that narrowed down a specific location. The re-interviews yielded conflicting accounts as witnesses who'd been certain about details in 1981 now second-guessed themselves, admitted they might have been mistaken about times or descriptions, confessed that media coverage had influenced their memories. The dark sedan one witness reported seeing near County Road 14 might have been blue, or maybe it was a truck, or perhaps it had been a different day entirely. Memory, Fernandez learned, was a story people told themselves, constantly revised and rewritten, until the truth became indistinguishable from imagination. The most promising development came from genealogical DNA technology that had begun solving cold cases across the country in the late 2000s. Fernandez submitted DNA evidence from Sarah's hairbrush, preserved carefully by Carol Mitchell for nearly 3 decades, to a genetic genealogy database. The hope was that if Sarah's remains were ever found and identified through DNA, or if evidence from the crime scene contained the perpetrator's genetic material, they could use family connections to trace suspects. But there was no crime scene DNA to analyze, nothing that definitively belonged to anyone other than Sarah herself. The technology was revolutionary, but it required something to work with, some genetic puzzle piece left behind by whoever had taken her. In Sarah Mitchell's case, there was nothing. Whoever had abducted her had been careful or lucky, leaving no biological trace. By 2011, Fernandez's investigation had reached the same wall that had stopped every previous attempt. Without new evidence, without witnesses who'd seen something concrete, without physical remains to analyze, the case couldn't move forward. Sheriff Hayes held a press conference on the 30th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, standing in front of television cameras with Carol Mitchell beside her, now 72 years old and frail, her hair completely white, her hands shaking as she clutched a photograph of her daughter. Hayes promised the investigation would remain open, that advances in technology gave reason for hope, that someone out there knew something, and she urged them to come forward. But everyone could hear the defeat beneath the professional words. 30 years was a long time. People died, memories faded, evidence degraded. The window for solving Sarah Mitchell's disappearance was closing, if it hadn't already closed. The case went cold again, returned to digital files and boxes in the evidence room. Carol Mitchell continued her annual visits to the memorial stone, her grief as fresh in 2015 as it had been in 1982. She told reporters who occasionally called on slow news days that she would die without knowing what happened to her daughter, that this was the cruelest form of torture, the not knowing. She said she'd made peace with Sarah being gone but would never make peace with the silence, with whoever had done this walking free, living their life while hers remained frozen at 4:28 on October 9, 1981. The third reopening came in 2019, not through official channels but through persistence. A young detective named Melissa Chen, no relation to David Chen, who'd been a deputy during the original investigation, had grown up in Madison hearing stories about the Pine Ridge disappearance from her grandmother who'd lived in Meadow County in the 1980s. Chen joined the sheriff's department in 2017. 23 years old and hungry to prove herself in a profession still dominated by men who questioned whether women had the temperament for detective work. She'd requested assignment to cold cases, surprising her supervisors who expected young officers to want high-profile work, drug busts, and armed robbery investigations that made careers. But Chen had been studying criminal justice at the University of Wisconsin with a focus on cold case methodology, had written her senior thesis on advances in forensic genealogy, and she believed strongly that victims like Sarah Mitchell deserved justice no matter how much time had passed. Chen spent her first year reviewing every unsolved case in Meadow County going back 50 years, creating prioritization matrices based on available evidence, likelihood of resolution, and investigative resources required. The Sarah Mitchell case ranked at the top of her list. There was preserved physical evidence, detailed witness statements, a clear timeline, and most importantly, family members still alive who deserved answers. Chen presented her analysis to Sheriff Hayes, now in her second term and approaching retirement, asking for permission to take another look at the case with fresh eyes and newer technology that had continued advancing since 2009. Hayes was skeptical, having poured resources into the investigation a decade earlier with nothing to show for it, but she respected Chen's thoroughness and gave her approval with the caveat that it couldn't interfere with active cases. Chen approached the investigation differently than her predecessors. Instead of focusing on the day Sarah disappeared, or the immediate physical evidence, she studied the community itself, the social networks and relationships that existed in Pine Ridge in 1981. She built a database of every person who'd lived in Meadow County that year, cross-referencing phone books and school records and employment data and church registries, creating a map of human connections that previous investigators hadn't thought to compile. She tracked where people had worked, who they'd associated with, what vehicles they'd owned, where they'd moved in the years after the disappearance. It was painstaking work that generated thousands of names and millions of data points, most of them irrelevant. But Chen believed that somewhere in that sea of information was a pattern that would point towards Sarah's abductor. She also utilized social media in ways impossible during earlier investigations. She created a Facebook page dedicated to the case, posting details and photographs, asking people to share memories and information. The page reached former Pine Ridge residents scattered across the country, people who'd moved away decades ago but still remembered October 9, 1981. Tips came in slowly. Most of them recycled information from old news stories, but a few contained details never previously reported. A woman who'd been a freshman at Meadow County High in 1981 remembered seeing a man in a brown jacket watching students in the parking lot that week, someone she didn't recognize, but she'd never mentioned it to police because she wasn't sure if it meant anything. A former volunteer from the search parties recalled finding a cigarette butt near where Sarah's backpack was discovered, something he'd pointed out to deputies who'd dismissed it as trash. These fragments weren't breakthroughs, but they were threads, and Chen pulled on every one. By early 2020, as the world began shutting down for a pandemic that would reshape everything, Chen had assembled what she believed was the most comprehensive analysis of the Sarah Mitchell case ever compiled. She had timelines accurate to the minute, maps showing every relevant location, profiles of every person of interest ever investigated, and a growing conviction that the answer had always been hiding in plain sight, obscured by assumptions made in the chaos of the original investigation. She just needed to find it. Detective Melissa Chen sat in her basement office at the Meadow County Sheriff's Department on a Tuesday morning in March of 2023, surrounded by whiteboards covered in photographs and timelines and names, connected by different colored strings, that would have looked like conspiracy theory madness to anyone who didn't understand cold case methodology. She'd been assigned this windowless space because it was the only room large enough to accommodate the physical manifestation of her investigation, a three-dimensional puzzle she'd been assembling for 4 years. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air smelled like old coffee and dry erase markers. On her desk sat 3 computer monitors displaying different databases simultaneously, one showing the genealogical DNA system she'd uploaded Sarah Mitchell's genetic profile into, another running facial recognition software she was using to analyze old photographs from 1981, and the third containing her master spreadsheet of every person who'd lived in Pine Ridge that October. The breakthrough came not from advanced technology, but from something far simpler, a library card. Chen had been reviewing the original evidence inventory for perhaps the 100th time, looking at the list of items found in Sarah's backpack when it was discovered on County Road 14. School books, notebooks, pencils, wallet, chewing gum, and the library book she'd checked out on October 6th, The Cosmos, by Carl Sagan. Chen had always found it significant that Sarah had been carrying that particular book, a 700-page hardcover about astronomy that aligned perfectly with her dreams of studying the stars. But it wasn't until March 14, 2023, 42 years and 5 months after Sarah's disappearance, that Chen thought to check whether anyone else had checked out that same book around the same time. The Pine Ridge Public Library had digitized its old card catalog records in 2005 as part of a modernization project, scanning decades of handwritten checkout cards before discarding the physical copies. Chen had obtained access to this database months earlier, but hadn't thought to search for specific titles, focusing instead on whether any suspicious individuals had library accounts in 1981. Now she pulled up the record for the Cosmos and found that Sarah had checked it out on October 6th, 3 days before she disappeared. But there was another entry that made Chen's pulse quicken. The same book had been checked out previously on September 23rd, 1981, and returned on October 5th, just 1 day before Sarah borrowed it. The name on that checkout record was James Whitmore. Chen cross-referenced the name against her master database. James Whitmore had been 29 years old in October of 1981, unmarried, working as a custodian at Meadow County High School. He'd been employed there since 1978, was responsible for cleaning classrooms and maintaining the building after school hours. He'd been interviewed during the original investigation, as had every school employee, but had never been considered a serious suspect. His statement to Sheriff Wade had been brief and unremarkable. He'd seen Sarah around school but didn't know her personally, had been working in the gymnasium that afternoon, cleaning the bleachers when she left the building, hadn't noticed anything unusual. His background check had been clean, no criminal record, no history of complaints. He'd continued working at the high school until 1997, when he'd left for reasons the personnel records listed simply as voluntary resignation. After that, the trail went cold. Chen began digging deeper into James Whitmore's life. She found his social security number in old tax records and used it to track his employment history. After leaving the high school, he'd worked at a warehouse in Madison for 3 years, then as a night security guard at a manufacturing plant, then had stopped appearing in employment databases around 2003. She searched property records and found he'd purchased a small house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge in 1991, paid cash according to the deed records, had lived there quietly for decades. The house was still in his name, property taxes paid annually through automatic bank withdrawal. Chen felt her investigative instincts sharpening. Here was someone who'd had access to Sarah at school, who'd shared an interest in the same book about astronomy, who'd left his job at the high school 16 years after the disappearance for no stated reason, and who lived a solitary life that left minimal traces in public records. She ran Whitmore's name through criminal databases at the state and federal level. Nothing appeared, not even a traffic ticket. She searched social media and found no profiles, no digital footprint at all, which was unusual but not unheard of for someone in their 70s. She checked death records to confirm he was still alive and found nothing, which suggested he was either living quietly in that house on Pine Ridge's outskirts or had moved without updating his property information. Chen mapped the location of Whitmore's house and felt a chill run down her spine. The property was less than a mile from County Road 14, just half a mile from where Sarah's backpack had been found. Chen brought her findings to Sheriff Margaret Hayes, now 63, and in her final year before retirement. Hayes listened carefully as Chen explained the library connection, the timeline, the geographic proximity of Whitmore's house to where evidence had been discovered. Hayes had seen too many promising leads dissolve into nothing over her career to get excited prematurely, but she trusted Chen's instincts and authorized surveillance of Whitmore's property. Chen and Detective Frank Morrison, a veteran investigator who'd worked cold cases for 15 years, drove out to the address on a Thursday afternoon in late March. The house sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by bare trees and muddy fields, a small white structure with peeling paint and sagging gutters. A rusted pickup truck from the 1990s sat in the driveway. Curtains were drawn across every window. They watched the house from a distance for 3 days, rotating shifts with 2 other deputies, documenting who came and went. The answer was simple: nobody. The house appeared abandoned, except for occasional movement visible through gaps in the curtains, shadows passing behind windows at odd hours. The mailbox remained empty, suggesting Whitmore had his mail held or delivered elsewhere. On the 4th day, Chen ran a more detailed property search and discovered that Whitmore also owned a 10-acre parcel of wooded land about 3 miles away, purchased in 1984, 3 years after Sarah's disappearance. The land was undeveloped, no structures listed on the tax records, just forest and a small creek that ran through the southeastern corner. Chen requested cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar for both properties. Sheriff Hayes hesitated, knowing that deploying those resources without stronger evidence could be seen as harassment if Whitmore was innocent. But Chen argued they had probable cause based on the constellation of circumstances: Whitmore's proximity to the victim, his access to her at school, the shared interest in astronomy, the unexplained resignation, the isolated properties purchased with cash. Hayes approved the request but insisted they needed to interview Whitmore first, give him opportunity to explain the connections before treating him like a suspect. On April 2nd, 2023, Chen and Morrison knocked on the door of James Whitmore's house at 9 in the morning. They waited 3 minutes before the door opened slightly, held by a chain lock. The man who peered through the gap was tall and thin with gray hair and deeply lined skin, his eyes watery and suspicious. Chen identified herself and Morrison, explained they were investigating a cold case and had some routine questions, asked if they could come inside. Whitmore said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving between the 2 detectives. Then he closed the door. Chen heard the chain sliding free, and the door opened wider. Whitmore stepped back without speaking, a gesture that seemed like invitation. The interior of the house was dim and cluttered, filled with boxes and stacks of old newspapers and books piled on every surface. The air smelled musty and stale, like a place that hadn't been properly ventilated in years. Whitmore led them to a small living room where a television played with the sound muted, showing an old Western movie. He sat in a worn armchair and gestured vaguely toward a couch covered with folded laundry. Morrison moved the clothes aside and they sat. Chen took out a notebook and asked Whitmore if he remembered working at Meadow County High School in 1981. He nodded slowly. She asked if he remembered Sarah Mitchell. His expression didn't change. He said he remembered when she disappeared, that everyone did. Chen asked about the library book, about the cosmos, about why he'd checked it out just before Sarah did. Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. He said he liked astronomy, had always been interested in space, didn't see what that had to do with anything. Chen pressed further, asked about his resignation from the high school in 1997, about why he'd left a stable job. Whitmore said he'd gotten tired of cleaning up after teenagers, wanted something different, didn't think he needed to explain his employment choices to police. His voice remained flat and controlled, but his hands gripped the armrests tightly. Morrison asked about the wooded property, about what Whitmore did with 10 acres of forest. Whitmore said it was an investment, that he'd thought about building a cabin there but never got around to it, that it was private property, and he didn't appreciate the implication in Morrison's tone. The interview lasted 40 minutes and yielded nothing concrete. Whitmore answered every question but volunteered nothing, his responses carefully minimal. When Chen asked if he'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for elimination purposes, Whitmore asked if he was being accused of something. Chen said no, this was routine. They were re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Whitmore said he'd think about it and would contact a lawyer if he decided to cooperate further. He stood up, making it clear the conversation was over. Chen left her card on a side table, and they departed. Back at the station, Chen felt certain they were close to something. Whitmore's behavior had been defensive, evasive, the response of someone with something to hide. But defensive and evasive wasn't evidence. They needed something concrete. Sheriff Hayes authorized the deployment of cadaver dogs to Whitmore's wooded property, arguing they had sufficient probable cause based on the totality of circumstances even without his cooperation. The search was scheduled for April 10th, pending weather conditions and availability of the canine units from the state police. The dogs arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 German shepherds trained specifically to detect human remains, even those buried for decades. Chen and Morrison accompanied the handlers and their team of forensic technicians as they worked through the 10 acres systematically. The dogs moved through the woods with their noses low to the ground, occasionally stopping to investigate particular spots before moving on. The handlers explained that decomposition left chemical signatures in soil that could persist for generations, that these dogs could detect remains even after all organic material had degraded to bone fragments or dust. At 2:15 in the afternoon, one of the dogs, a 7-year-old male named Atlas, stopped at a spot near the creek and began barking intensely, pawing at the ground. The handler called for the team. Chen felt her heart pounding as forensic technicians marked the location and began carefully removing layers of soil and leaf litter. 18 inches down, they found fabric. Denim, partially deteriorated, but still recognizable. Beneath the fabric were bones, small and delicate, arranged in a way that suggested they'd been placed carefully rather than scattered by animals. The forensic anthropologist on scene confirmed they were human remains, likely female based on pelvic structure, age consistent with late adolescence. They excavated carefully over the next 6 hours as daylight faded and portable lights were brought in to illuminate the scene. The remains were incomplete, damaged by decades of exposure to moisture and soil acidity, but enough remained for analysis. Mixed with the bones were remnants of clothing, a yellow sweater reduced to fibers, white fabric that might have been canvas shoes, metal eyelets that could have come from sneakers. Chen stood at the edge of the excavation site watching the painstaking work, knowing with absolute certainty that they'd found Sarah Mitchell, that she'd been here all along. Buried less than 4 miles from her family's home, hidden on property owned by a man who'd walked past her in school hallways, who'd shared her interest in the cosmos, who'd taken that interest as invitation or opportunity. Detective Melissa Chen stood in the observation room at the Meadow County Sheriff's Department at 7:30 on the morning of April 11, 2023, watching James Whitmore through the one-way mirror. He sat alone at a metal table in interview room 2, his hands folded in his lap, his expression blank and distant. He'd been arrested at 6:15 that morning at his house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, taken into custody without resistance as dawn broke gray and cold over the property where Sarah Mitchell's remains had been discovered the previous day. The arrest warrant had been signed by Judge Patricia Morrison at midnight, based on the totality of evidence: the remains found on Whitmore's property, the library connection, his access to Sarah at the high school, his suspicious behavior during the initial interview, and forensic analysis that had worked through the night to confirm the bones belonged to a female aged 16 to 18, who died approximately 40 to 45 years earlier. Sheriff Margaret Hayes stood beside Chen, arms crossed, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd been awake for 30 hours straight. She'd personally notified Carol Mitchell at 10 o'clock the previous evening, driving to the assisted living facility in Madison, where Carol had moved 3 years earlier when living alone became too difficult. Hayes had sat with the 79-year-old woman in a quiet room away from other residents and told her that after 43 years, they'd found Sarah, that her daughter was coming home. Carol had collapsed into Hayes's arms, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to contain every year of waiting, every October 9th marked with grief, every prayer that had gone unanswered until now. She'd asked if Sarah had suffered, and Hayes had told her the truth they knew so far, that forensic analysis would take time, but there were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones beyond what time and burial had caused. Whether that was mercy or simply incomplete information, Hayes couldn't say. James Whitmore had said nothing since his arrest, beyond requesting an attorney. A public defender named Robert Michaels had arrived 20 minutes earlier, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses who'd spent 15 minutes conferring with his client in private before emerging to say Whitmore was willing to make a statement. Chen had been surprised by this development. Most defense attorneys advised complete silence, especially in cases involving physical evidence as damning as human remains on a suspect's property. But Michaels said his client wanted to talk, wanted to explain, and while Michaels had advised against it, he couldn't stop a defendant who insisted on speaking. Chen suspected Whitmore had been carrying this secret for so long that the relief of finally releasing it outweighed whatever legal consequences might follow. Chen entered the interview room at 7:45 with Detective Frank Morrison. They sat across from Whitmore and Michaels. Chen placed a digital recorder on the table and stated the date, time, and names of everyone present. She read Whitmore his Miranda rights again, even though he'd been read them during arrest, confirming he understood and was waiving his right to remain silent. Whitmore's voice was quiet when he said yes. He understood. He wanted to talk. His hands remained folded on the table, fingers interlaced, knuckles white with pressure. He was 71 years old now, had lived more than twice as long as Sarah Mitchell had been given, and the weight of those years showed in every line of his face. Chen began with a simple question. Did Whitmore know why he'd been arrested? He nodded slowly and said because they'd found her, found what he'd buried on his property in October of 1981. Chen asked him to be specific, to say the name. Whitmore's jaw tightened, and after a moment he said Sarah Mitchell, that he'd killed Sarah Mitchell and buried her in the woods he'd later purchased to ensure no one would ever find her. The words came out flat and emotionless, as if he were reading from a script he'd rehearsed for decades. Michaels closed his eyes and shook his head slightly, knowing his client had just confessed to murder in a recorded interview that would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Morrison asked Whitmore to start from the beginning, to explain how he'd come to kill a 17-year-old girl. Whitmore sat silent for nearly a minute, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Chen's shoulder. Then he began talking, and the story that emerged was both more banal and more disturbing than any theory investigators had developed over 43 years. He said he'd first noticed Sarah Mitchell in the spring of 1981, seen her in the hallways at Meadow County High School, where he worked as a custodian. He said she was different from other students, quieter, more thoughtful, always carrying books and reading during lunch instead of socializing. He said he'd started paying attention to her schedule, learning when she had free periods, which classrooms she studied in, what time she left school each day. He said he'd discovered their shared interest in astronomy by accident. He'd been cleaning the library one evening in September when he noticed the checkout cards and returned books, saw Sarah's name on multiple titles about space and physics and planetary science. He said he'd been interested in astronomy since childhood, had taught himself about constellations and galaxies, had dreamed of working at an observatory before settling into the mundane reality of custodial work. He said seeing Sarah's name on those checkout cards made him feel a connection to her, made him believe they understood each other in ways other people wouldn't appreciate. He checked out the cosmos in late September, specifically because he'd seen Sarah looking at it, wanting to read what she'd read, to inhabit her thoughts. Chen felt her stomach turning as Whitmore described his obsession in careful, measured terms. He said he'd started finding excuses to be in areas where Sarah spent time, cleaning near her locker, emptying trash bins in the library while she studied. He said he'd never spoken to her directly, knew that would be inappropriate given their age difference and his position at the school, but he'd convinced himself that his feelings were pure, that he appreciated her mind rather than harboring darker intentions. Chen had heard this justification before from predators who dressed their obsessions in intellectual clothing, who claimed to recognize special qualities in their victims that excused stalking and violation. Whitmore said his fantasies about Sarah remained just that until October 9th. He said he'd been working late that afternoon, cleaning the chemistry lab after Sarah and her lab partner finished their project. He said he'd watched them through the window as they packed up their bags and left the building, had seen Sarah walk across the parking lot toward the road that led into town. He said something had shifted in him at that moment. Some barrier that had kept his obsession contained suddenly dissolved. He said he'd finished cleaning quickly, clocked out, and driven his car, an old brown Chevrolet sedan, out of the employee parking lot with the intention of following her home, just to see where she lived, to know more about her world. He caught up to Sarah on Maple Avenue around 4:30. She was walking alone, her backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware she was being followed. Whitmore said he'd driven past her slowly, then turned at the next corner and waited, letting her walk out of sight before pulling forward again. He said he did this several times, a pattern of surveillance that kept him at a distance while maintaining visual contact. When Sarah turned onto 6th Street, a quieter residential area with fewer houses and more trees, Whitmore said the compulsion that had been building in him became overwhelming. He pulled ahead of her and parked on the shoulder, got out of his car, and stood waiting as she approached. Chen asked what happened when Sarah reached him. Whitmore's voice remained flat as he described how he'd greeted her, said he'd recognized her from school, asked if she needed a ride home because it looked like rain. He said Sarah had been polite but declined, said she didn't live far and preferred to walk. He said he'd pressed the issue, told her he was heading in that direction anyway, that it was no trouble. Sarah had thanked him again but kept walking. Whitmore said that's when something broke inside him, when her rejection triggered a rage he didn't know he possessed. He said he'd grabbed her arm, and when she tried to pull away and started to scream, he'd covered her mouth with his hand and dragged her toward his car. The struggle lasted less than a minute. Sarah fought, Whitmore said, was stronger than he'd expected, managed to drop her backpack on the sidewalk before he forced her into the passenger seat of his sedan. He said he'd hit her twice in the head to stop her from screaming, used his belt to tie her hands, and driven away while she was stunned and bleeding from a cut above her left eye. He said he'd headed south on County Road 14 because it was isolated, because he needed time to think, needed to figure out what he was going to do now that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. He said he'd driven for several miles before pulling off onto a dirt access road that led into state forest land, a place where he'd gone hiking before, where he knew no one would see his car. Chen felt Morrison tense beside her as Whitmore described what happened next. He said he'd parked deep in the woods and turned to look at Sarah, who was crying and asking why he was doing this, begging him to let her go. He said he'd started to untie her hands, had some vague idea that he'd apologize and take her home and somehow convince her not to tell anyone what he'd done. But then Sarah had started screaming again, and he'd panicked, put his hands around her throat to silence her. He said he'd only meant to quiet her for a moment, to make her stop screaming so he could think. But his hands had stayed on her neck, and she'd stopped struggling, and when he finally let go, she wasn't breathing anymore. Whitmore said he'd sat in that car for more than an hour with Sarah's body in the passenger seat, trying to understand what he'd done, trying to find a way to undo it. When he finally accepted that she was dead, and there was no reversing what had happened, he'd started thinking about logistics. He said he'd driven back toward Pine Ridge, stopping along County Road 14 to throw Sarah's backpack into a ditch, creating evidence that would suggest she'd been taken somewhere far away. Then he'd returned to the forest access road and carried her body deep into the woods, using a shovel he kept in his trunk for winter emergencies to dig a shallow grave near a creek where the ground was soft. He said he'd buried her there and covered the site with leaves and branches, then driven home and burned his clothes in a barrel behind his house. Chen asked why he'd purchased the land 3 years later. Whitmore said he'd been terrified someone would find the grave, that hunters or hikers would stumble across the disturbed earth and call police. He said he'd saved money from his custodian's salary until he had enough to buy the 10 acres that contained Sarah's burial site, ensuring he controlled access and could monitor for any signs of discovery. He said he'd visited the grave regularly over the years, maintaining it in a perverse way, clearing brush and debris, making sure nothing drew attention to the spot. He said he'd told himself he was keeping Sarah company, but he knew that was a lie he used to rationalize his need to ensure the secret stayed buried. Morrison asked why Whitmore had resigned from the high school in 1997. Whitmore said working there had become unbearable. Every teenager he saw reminded him of Sarah. Every girl carrying books in the hallway was an accusation. He said he'd started having nightmares, seeing Sarah's face in crowds, hearing her voice calling his name. He said leaving the school was an act of self-preservation, though it did nothing to ease the guilt that had been eating at him for 16 years by that point. He said he'd moved through subsequent jobs like a ghost, never forming relationships, never allowing anyone to know him well enough to ask questions about his past or notice the darkness he carried. Chen asked if Whitmore felt remorse for what he'd done. His expression changed for the first time during the interview, something that might have been pain or regret flickering across his features. He said every day for 43 years he'd felt remorse, that Sarah Mitchell had haunted every moment of his life, that he'd been serving a sentence of his own design long before police knocked on his door. But Chen had investigated enough murders to know that regret wasn't the same as remorse, that Whitmore's suffering was narcissistic and self-pitying, focused on his own discomfort rather than the life he'd stolen and the family he'd destroyed. Real remorse would have driven him to confess decades earlier, to give the Mitchells closure instead of letting them suffer through 43 Octobers wondering what had happened to their daughter. The interview concluded at 9:20. Whitmore was returned to his holding cell while Chen and Morrison briefed Sheriff Hayes on the confession. The legal machinery began moving immediately. The county prosecutor, Elizabeth Warren, reviewed the recorded interview and physical evidence, consulting with the forensic team that was still processing Sarah's remains and the burial site. DNA extracted from bone marrow confirmed the remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell, matched against the genetic profile created from her preserved hairbrush. Forensic anthropologists found a fractured hyoid bone in the neck, consistent with strangulation. Soil samples from the burial site matched samples taken from the undercarriage of Whitmore's old pickup truck, which he'd kept for decades in his garage. Every piece of evidence supported his confession. News of the arrest spread through Pine Ridge within hours. The small town that had lived with Sarah Mitchell's ghost for more than 4 decades suddenly had answers, and the answers were devastating. James Whitmore had been a familiar figure at the high school for 19 years, someone parents and students had trusted with their safety, someone who'd cleaned their classrooms and fixed their broken equipment, and existed in that category of people who are seen but never really noticed. Learning that he'd been a murderer hiding in plain sight, that he'd continued working at the school for 16 years after killing Sarah, that he'd purchased land specifically to conceal her body, shattered whatever sense of security the community had managed to rebuild. The local news stations that had covered Sarah's disappearance in 1981 sent crews back to Meadow County, their reporters standing in front of the sheriff's department delivering updates to viewers who remembered the original case and younger viewers learning about it for the first time. The story went national within 24 hours. Featured on cable news networks and true crime podcasts and social media platforms, where people debated the psychology of killers who managed to function in society for decades while carrying terrible secrets. James Whitmore's booking photo, showing a thin, elderly man with hollow eyes and gray hair, appeared on screens across the country alongside Sarah's school picture from 1981. The smiling girl with freckles and dreams of studying stars who'd never made it home from school one October afternoon. Carol Mitchell was brought to the sheriff's department on April 12th to meet with Chen and Hayes. She moved slowly with a walker, her daughter Amy Carlson, now 59 years old, supporting her arm. They sat in Hayes' office, away from the media circus outside, and Chen walked them through what investigators had learned, explaining as gently as possible how Sarah had died and where she'd been all these years. Carol wept quietly, but there was something like peace in her expression beneath the grief. She said knowing was better than the torture of not knowing, that she could finally lay her daughter to rest properly, could visit a grave that actually contained her child rather than just a memorial marker. Amy asked if Sarah had suffered, if those final moments had been painful. Chen couldn't lie but tried to provide what small comfort the facts allowed. It had been quick. Sarah likely lost consciousness within seconds. She wouldn't have felt prolonged pain. Carol asked if she could see James Whitmore, could look him in the eye and ask him why. Hayes said that wasn't possible, that Whitmore was in custody and wouldn't be allowed visitors beyond his attorney. Carol said she didn't want revenge or justice in the legal sense. Those concepts felt meaningless after 43 years. She said she just wanted to understand how a person could do what he'd done and then live with it, could walk past the families destroyed by his actions and continue existing as if he deserved the life he'd stolen from Sarah. Hayes said some questions had no satisfactory answers, that trying to understand evil often meant descending into darkness that damaged those who looked too closely. Carol nodded slowly and said perhaps that was true, perhaps some things were better left incomprehensible. James Whitmore was formally charged with first-degree murder on April 15, 2023. He pleaded guilty at his arraignment 3 weeks later, sparing the Mitchell family and the community of Pine Ridge the ordeal of a trial. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole, the maximum penalty under Wisconsin law. Whitmore showed no emotion as the sentence was read, his face blank and distant, the same expression he'd worn through decades of pretending to be someone harmless. Sarah Mitchell was finally laid to rest on June 2, 2023, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people who'd never stopped remembering her. Carol Mitchell, now 80 years old, stood beside the grave and said her daughter could finally stop wandering in the darkness. Detective Melissa Chen attended the funeral, standing quietly at the back, knowing that justice delivered 43 years late was still justice. That cold cases solved gave hope to every family, still waiting for answers about loved ones who vanished without explanation. Pine Ridge remains changed by what happened in 1981, but the town finally knows its ghost's name and where she rests. The memorial stone beneath the maple tree still stands, but now Sarah's actual grave lies beside it, marked with words her mother chose, forever loved, forever home, forever among the stars. Carol Mitchell passed away peacefully in her sleep on October 8, 2024, one day before the 43rd anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. Those who knew her said she'd held on just long enough to see Sarah properly buried, to finally know the truth she'd waited a lifetime to learn. She was laid to rest beside her daughter beneath the maple tree in Pine Ridge Cemetery, reunited after decades of separation. James Whitmore remains incarcerated at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He has never expressed remorse beyond his initial confession. Detective Melissa Chen continues investigating cold cases in Meadow County, driven by the certainty that every victim deserves their story told, their truth uncovered, no matter how many years have passed.